well, Joseph Conrad. Here he is. I came across him years ago when I was writing this book, Steaming East, and I thought it was a quotation that I couldn't possibly forego. But I was, I've always been interested in the Suez Canal, etc., etc. And it really is, as you all know, I don't know if there's a light that I can put on. But it does remain, of course, the shortest and quickest shipping route between Europe and Asia. That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I shouldn't be reading my notes, but I am occasionally. I think it's actually fascinating. It's very large crude carriers can only pass through it by lightening the oil at the southern end of the Sumed into the Sumed pipeline and then reloading it again at the other end. And then meanwhile, Panama is expanding its canal. Nicaragua is planning a canal. We don't know quite how far that has got. And therefore Suez surely has to compete. And about 4 years ago, its expansion was to deepen and widen the canal to facilitate the passage of more boats through, as well as speeding up the route, was planned. And then about a year ago, last August, President Sisi suddenly announced that this was going to take a year. It would all be finished in a year. And that's the sort of thing that I was quite impressed by that. And then about 2 or 3 months after that, I noted the launching of one of these gigantic containers, container vessels, which I'll show you at the end. And somehow the combination of those two things coincided with Alan saying, come up with something that you'd like to talk about, and I decided on the Suez Canal. So that's what we're going to look at this morning. Well, it's really this afternoon now. The scheme that Sisi has devised, or was already underway, includes 6 tunnels under the canal into the Sinai Peninsula. Those have not yet been built. And then the development of a huge industrial zone, also mainly on the Asian side of the canal. Again, that remains to be seen. But the idea of that, I'll talk about that towards the end anyway. So here you've got a picture of the canal. Personally, I think any talk, any subject that includes something to do with world commerce, I think partly because it's never been part of my life particularly, I think is absolutely fascinating, and I hope that probably some of you here agree with me. And the Suez Canal, of course, crucial to those communications, opening in 1869. My thoughts in particular actually on the Red Sea and its communications between the Mediterranean and Europe as well as the Indian Ocean. I developed first in the course of writing this book, which I enjoyed writing enormously, published in 1991. It is available on Amazon. The copies there, I'm afraid, are not for sale. In the course of writing the book, of course, I learned a whole lot more about all sorts of other things, developments between Europe and India in the 19th century in particular. So that, in the book, in fact, looks at the development of steam and transport through Europe, at the Middle East, Central Asia and Constantinople. It actually included not just marine steam, but also rail transport. And that I found just as exciting, really, as the steamboats. For me, it was a completely new field, and it was one that I enjoyed researching enormously. Then subsequently, when I was chairing the Society for Arabian Studies, which is now called BIFSA, the British Foundation for the Study of Arabia, I helped initiate a whole series of conferences on the Red Sea, which mainly a lot of the topics, there have now been 7 of them actually, the last one was in Naples this last summer. The topics, a lot of them were archaeological and historical, tracing links between, of course, Africa and Asia, but also, of course, between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. And that, in fact, was, again, what interested me particularly. And my own contributions in these conferences have often focused, again, on the 19th century, and in particular, development of steam communications, and also the charting of the Red Sea. That was a very interesting venture, and again, tied in with the plans for the Suez Canal, the communications between Europe and India, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure many of you know the history of ancient attempts to facilitate communications between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. And the Pharos Isostris is thought to have been the first to conceive the idea of a canal connecting the Nile with the Red Sea in the 2nd millennium BC, and a little later Queen Hatshepsut possibly is thought to have ordered the digging of a canal for the import of myrrh. 1,000 years later, Pharaoh Nietzsche built a canal connecting, as you see here, connecting the delta with the Red Sea, and that canal was revived by the Emperor Trajan in the 1st century AD and was used on and off until the Arab conquest and expansion in the 7th century AD, when it was used to take Egyptian wheat to the Hijaz. So the idea of linking Mediterranean and Red Sea is a very old one, and current throughout the Middle Ages, but mainly via the Upper Nile, thereby avoiding the prevailing northern winds in the upper half of the Red Sea. So the growth of European interest in India, political of course as well as commercial, soon led to frustration at the length of the voyage via the Cape. 4 to 8 months from sailing from Southampton to Calcutta in the late 18th century. And Thomas Twining, for instance, 1792, age 16, was told when he went on board he must take several suits of clothing with him because he would grow so much during the voyage. Much more important, much more significant, in fact, and the point was also made in 1803 when the Marquess of Wellesley complained that in the present year I was nearly 7 months without receiving one single note of intelligence from England. And if you can imagine at the time the warfare that was going on actually in Europe, how painful it was for him actually to have no idea what was going on. So the idea of a direct link between the Isthmus of Suez and the Mediterranean was then taken up by Napoleon and his team of savants in 1798. As you all know, he invaded Egypt and was nagged by Marseille merchants to actually investigate the idea of a direct link from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. His engineers did in fact survey the land, but they decided that the difference in level between the two was too great to make a canal feasible. However, as European involvement in India developed, another idea came up. And here you have the young man, Thomas Waghorn, who is now, will I be able to work a pointer, I wonder? I think it must be one of these. No, sorry, oh Lord, it's now done worse than ever. Anyway, Waghorn is the young man there.
It's this green.
Green one, how could I not know that, the green one? Right, here we are. This is Waghorn here. This is Muhammad Ali. This is David Roberts sketching away. And Waghorn is trying to persuade Muhammad Ali to let him develop a connection through Egypt for passengers, not trade, passengers to India. And the idea was that you would steam through the Mediterranean, you disembark in Alexandria, you then go by canal, developed by Muhammad Ali, to Cairo, then you would go over land to Suez. Not terribly comfortable, it has to be said, as you can see from this image, but you were sure you could get champagne at the halfway house on the way. Anyway, meanwhile, a British Army surveyor, Francis Chesney, concluded that, in fact, the difference of level between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean was actually not that great. We shall come back to that in a minute. Chesney himself, in fact, was heavily involved in trying to develop an overland route to India via Syria and the Euphrates. I'm afraid it didn't actually work out. Anyway, he may have discussed this idea of a link between Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, Red Sea, with a young man serving as French vice-consul in Alexandria, who later generously described Chesney as the father of the canal. And this was Ferdinand de Lesseps, as you see here, astride what was becoming the canal, with his mallet. I don't actually think de Lesseps ever used that mallet, but he liked to parade as if he did. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but de Lesseps is said to have befriended the boy Muhammad, who became Khedive later, with sweeties. He was rather famous for this, and in fact Muhammad grew so fat on de Lesseps' goodies that actually he died rather young and was succeeded by Ismail Pasha. And he was who actually allowed the French to develop a financial company to build and operate a canal between what became Port Said and Suez. The British were furious, seeing the proposed canal as upsetting the geography of power in the Mediterranean in the context of the Eastern question, which I think was fair enough in a way. But chief among the opponents was Palmerston, inevitably, who described it as a bubble scheme designed to make people part with their money. The Times backed it, and so did Prince Albert. Funding was precarious throughout. I'm not quite sure how much of a historian President Sisi is, but he made it clear in August 2014 that only Egyptians could invest in the canal. And here you have triumphant de Lesseps, of course, and there you've got his canal. I'm not going to go into this in great deal. If you're really interested, you can read more about it in Steaming East over there. But the canal was dug with the help of thousands of forced labourers. And in 1869, it opened there was a fantastic inauguration in the new town, the very dusty town of Ismailia, halfway along. Ismailia described by journalist William Russell as a toy city in the wilderness, a pretty butterfly. I think there'd be lots of people actually who did not find it a pretty butterfly, and there may even be some people here who actually had spent time in Ismailia and would disagree with that definition. Anyway, it was attended by royalty from all over Europe, except Queen Victoria, who was too busy opening Holborn Viaduct to come. The Spectator sniffed. The Suez Canal may strengthen the hold of the West upon the East, sniffed the Spectator, but the ceremonies which accompanied at the opening will not tend to make increased authority additionally vivifying. Well, there you are. The Khedive, now Ismail. Here we've got the steam yacht Mauricio, which is still alive, as I shall tell you again. The Khedive steamed down the canal on the Mauricio, which now claims, in fact, to be the oldest steamboat yacht in the world. And she actually steamed across the Atlantic in 1976 to celebrate the American bicentenary. Anyway, on November 17th, a huge procession of state-of-the-art steamboats steamed down the canal, and they were led, in fact, by the leg here, which you see here, which would belong to Empress Josephine. In fact, probably her last sort of grand occasion, really. She was, in fact, a cousin of de Lesseps. And then you've got various other state-of-the-art steamboats trailing along behind, de Lesseps on board the leg, desperately hanging over the edge to make sure that, in fact, she didn't touch the bottom or the sides, because the canal at that point was really only just finished in time and still really quite narrow. So here we have the project, however, left Ismail deeply in debt, leading in 1876 to the sale of the Suez Canal Company shares, of Ismail's shares, 44% of the total, to the British government. They spent 4 million, now approximately 86 million pounds in 2014. By 1876, 4/5 of the traffic going through the canal was in fact British. But Disraeli took credit for the transaction, which happened pretty well overnight, but it was actually due to the quick thinking by the British branch of Rothschild, the bank, that the purchase was so rapidly ensured. Crucial, in fact, to preempt the French stepping in and preventing it. Dear Mama, wrote the future Kaiser to his English mother, Princess Victoria, I know that you will be delighted that England has bought the Suez Canal. How jolly! Gladstone saw it as an act of folly fraught with personal danger, but he did actually change his mind later. The French Suez Canal still remained the majority shareholder, but the canal and its significance in communication, political as well as commercial, to Britain and the British Empire in the East was soon established. And I thought, this I couldn't resist putting this in. It was shown up in an exhibition last year, The Voyage of the Lady Filmy Fern, and I thought it was so beautiful, trailing along behind, been pulled by camels and between these vast vessels, and here we got the pyramids. It was a wonderful image, so I thought I couldn't resist putting it in. And then a few images here. I'm afraid this one's slightly out of focus on the left there. But I just thought the idea of your posh voyage down the canal was too good to miss. and Toulouse-Lautrec over there on the right, and here music and games, card games, were all important on your posh voyage down the canal. And there, in fact, is the canal itself. It has actually been deepened and widened twice, I think, since de Lesseps Canal. But of course, the significant one we're talking about today is the one that has just happened. So there we are for the British. The Khedives, just reverting to a little bit more history of the British in Egypt. The Khedives' remaining shares were, of course, consolidated and duly placed under Anglo-French control. Egyptian opposition to this control and in the internal affairs of the country were brought to a head under the leadership of Colonel Arabi in 1882, which led to the invasion of the country by British forces, and in due course the establishment of what became known as the Veiled Protectorate. Effectively, British control of Egypt under a British Consul General, Lord Cromer, and in particular of the Suez Canal. So that's putting the 19th century history of British involvement in the canal in a very, very small nutshell. But I'm assuming that you all know a great deal more about it than I do anyway. In the 20th century, history highlighted the enormous strategic importance of the canal, reinforced in 2 world wars, and the success of Egypt ultimately in establishing its ownership of the canal, despite foreign efforts to prevent that, and of course today Egyptian hopes of linking the waterway more effectively and economically to the rest of the country. The internationalization of the canal was already assured under the Convention of Constantinople, 1888, guaranteeing free passage of shipping through the canal. Problems, of course, arose in 1915 during World War I. And I put these pictures in because it is those horses, the whalers brought over from Australia, that my grandmother, Dorothy Brooke, found harnessed to carriages in Cairo when she came in the early 30s and decided to set up the hospital for old war horses. They'd all been sold off to Egyptian farmers, and so they were in pretty bad states by the time my grandmother arrived in the early 30s. And so she set up the Brooke Hospital, which survives to this day, all the way up the Nile, in Pakistan, in India, in Ethiopia, all over the place. It's extraordinarily successful, relying, I think, on the British passion for helping animals in agony. Only horses and donkeys, and occasionally mules, but no camels. Anyway, so that's why I had to put these ones in here of the Australian whalers. We all need a drink. So, in fact, the Anzac forces were disembarked at the southern end of the canal at Suez in both 1915 and 1917, the latter to link up with Allenby's invasion of Palestine. And here, I've mentioned to Dorothy Brooke, but it was extremely important, and not too long ago, I came across a very touching poem written by one of the Australians about how he decides to shoot his horse in the desert rather than have it sold off to an Egyptian farmer. Anyway, after the war, as a result of negotiation, Egyptian independence was to some extent achieved in 1936. To the dissatisfaction, however, of many Egyptians, Britain still reserved the right to station troops on the west bank of the canal zone. And I'm sure some of you here, your parents may very well have been amongst those stationed in Ismailia through to the mid-50s. The freedom of navigation for international shipping was guaranteed, and of course, particularly with an eye to British imperial communications. The British were very heavily involved in persuading people that that canal must stay open. Then we have World War II and the problems there. World War II, here we've got images here. I haven't got any horses this time, thank goodness. And here we move on to nationalization. Post-war Egypt was growing opposition, as you can imagine, to the monarchy and its British backers. symbolized, in fact, in the eyes of Egyptians by the military presence based on the canal. Confrontation came to a head on Black Saturday. My father, for instance, was still working with Shell, for Shell in Cairo at this point, and that is when he and many others had to leave. My goodness, heavens above, they blew up the Turf Club and Shepherds. I mean, you couldn't possibly stay around in Cairo any longer. Farouk was forced into exile, and the government was taken over by the free officers, headed first by General Naguib, and then, of course, eventually by Gamal Abdel Nasser. And here you've got Nasser in Alexandria in 1955. Relations between Britain, with Eden as Foreign Secretary, and Egypt, increasingly under Nasser, continued to deteriorate, mainly due to failure to agree on Britain's role in maintaining troops on the canal. Agreement was finally reached in 1954, effectively ending the foreign occupation of Egypt. Both sides agreed to uphold the 1888 Convention guaranteeing that internationalization of the canal. That was always crucial, as you can imagine. Freedom of navigation in the canal. In fact, it did little to improve Egyptian relations with Britain. Britain and the US withdrew their pledge to finance the Aswan Dam, which meant that Nasser not only turned to Russia for help with financing the dam, but also nationalized the canal. And here he is celebrating the nationalization of the canal in 1956 in Alexandria. Actually, this is 1954. Then we get the Suez crisis as a result. Of course, as you see here, here's a plan. I felt this was the simplest way, actually, to describe the whole thing of the Suez crisis, which you can see here, the dates and the movement of troops. And most of you will be very familiar with the story, a disastrous one it was. As a result of the invasion, there were already several damaged vessels in the canal. Nasser ordered more to be sunk, thus blocking the canal, and it remained closed until April 1957. And here, I'm afraid these ones, I couldn't resist putting these in. And also this one, blocking the canal, the Colossus of Suez. More crises, of course. The canal was reopened with great panache, and later on, in fact 10 years later actually, 1967, the 6 Days War, the canal also got blocked. 15 cargo vessels were trapped in the canal for over 8 years, becoming known as the Yellow Fleet. So this is the blocking of the canal in 56. I rather like the idea who's been blocking canals and sinking ships in my bath. And then that rather good one there of a ship being sunk. And then here you've got the Yellow Fleet. This was extraordinary, actually. They were called the Yellow Fleet. They were stuck there. 67 to 75, they were called the Yellow Fleet because they all got covered with desert sand. And they developed their sports. They had swimming competitions, they had ping pong, they had everything. They had special stamps, as you see there, which you can, if anybody is a stamp enthusiast, you can find these, I believe, on the internet. Anyway, eventually the canal was reopened, this time opened by Anwar Sadat, and with great panache, accompanied by, amongst others, the Crown Prince of Iran. I think that passage through the canal has been uninterrupted since then. So now we come to now the new canal. Okay. Here it gives you some idea of the distances of shipping and the benefits, in fact, of the canal. So far, the large oil carriers can go through the canal, but there's a new generation planned which won't be able to go through the canal even when they've been lightened. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the competition with the Panama Canal particularly, which had all its locks improved and is due to reopen in 2016, and then Nicaragua planning a canal which the Chinese are very keen on, because this route here through the Suez Canal is their main connection, not only with Europe, but also with the east coast of the United States. So, The widened canal and deepened canal inaugurated by Sisi in August this year, August the 6th, with suitable fanfare and declaration of a public holiday. There were also special stamps and badges, medals rather. Here's the canal as it was, and here is as it is now. And what has happened is that the passage here in the Great Bitter Lakes has been widened and deepened extensively, and they have also built this, what they describe as a bypass here. Because previously, the blue line is the old one line, and now this facilitates, because of this curious system in the canal of you have to go in a convoy, of course, and traditionally it was two from coming down from the north, one going up from the south. And in fact, this has now been considerably shortened. The whole passageway is much shorter now and much speeded up. As I said at the beginning, it was started already when Sisi came to power, but he has actually speeded it up, as I said, by a whole year, and I think it's an extraordinary achievement, really. Whether it actually does what he would like it to do is another matter. Here, for instance, you've got the new generation of containers, which I shall come back to, and this is actually only 2013, and there have been several far bigger ones, 19,000 TEUs that have exceeded this one here, so you've got to go right out here. But they can still get through the canal. I'll come back to them in a minute. I think it's amazing. And then we've got Sisi here. Here is the opening, and here is the Mauricio. Once again, that steam yacht that belonged to the Khedive Ismail and steamed across the Atlantic in 1976. And Sisi on board in military uniform. You may remember when Sisi took power as president, he was obliged, or he obliged himself, to cease being a military officer. But here, for the occasion, he's put all his uniform back on again, badges and all. And here is the public holiday being celebrated in Cairo. I'm glad to see the ladies are allowed to celebrate, even if they do have to be wrapped up. And here is your medal. Not quite sure whom it was given to, but I rather like the one particularly on the left, with those two gigantic container vessels steaming side by side. Actually, on the one on the right, looks as if there's been a bit of a collision, and there was a collision last year. I'm not sure if I've still got an image of it. Anyway, with any luck, there would be no collisions as these vessels steam through the canal. A special medal struck. Oh, France sent, thinking back to the opening of the canal originally in 1869, France sent President Hollande on this occasion, and Russia sent the Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev. Not quite sure who went from England, but I suspect it was probably only the ambassador. Not a very good reputation for sending grand people to that sort of thing. And here we have one of these huge container vessels. They are amazing, actually. I'm just going to go back to that. Right. The Bala Channel, which is this one here, has been widened, actually. Oh, sorry. This one here has been widened considerably, actually, and deepened, as you can imagine, to 312 metres. The whole project, in fact, allows ships, as I said, to pass in both directions in these areas, cutting waiting times from 11 hours to 3 for most ships, which is actually remarkable. And hopefully increasing the capacity of the canal, the number of ships that can go through, from 97 ships a day through the canal from 45 to 97, which is quite remarkable. In fact, in 2014, 17,000 vessels went through the canal. So you can imagine the organisation of those, particularly with these huge container vessels, is quite something. And it's hoped, of course, that it will greatly increase Egypt's revenues, badly hit since 2011 by the decline in tourist revenues. I'm not quite sure how much that will actually work. There is quite a lot of doubt about it, particularly, of course, with current world economic woes, both in the Far East as well as in Europe. So whether that shipping will actually maintain its level, I think there's considerable doubt about it. CC's announcement, in fact, of the canal project was preceded by a few months. It preceded by a few months the launch of the Chinese container vessel, which you see here. Sorry, slightly. This was the collision, actually, with one of these huge container vessels and another one. So the potential. This happened actually before the widening of the canal was announced. And here you've got this huge, great vessel from China, which was launched in December last year. I was absolutely fascinated by it. You'll be pleased to hear that it can take 19,000 TEUs, or 156 million pairs of shoes, or 900 million tins of beans. Why, in fact, a container vessel wants to demonstrate its size by telling you how many pairs of shoes or tins of beans it contains, but somehow they frequently do this. There's another vessel, a Maersk vessel, which has also been launched, and again it uses this extraordinary capacity. They also tell you that it's equivalent to 4 football pitches in length, 16 metres draft. You see, that's quite something, actually, isn't it, when you think of it going through the canal. But the numbers of TEUs on board, of course, goes up all the time, and there have been several bigger vessels than this launched since this one. It's actually shown arriving here in Felixstowe. It was 1 month from China to Felixstowe. And Felixstowe itself has undergone an enormous expansion, thanks, I think, to mainly Chinese finance. It was planned over the last decade, in fact, and is ready in time now to take these huge vessels. But not all that many ports are. Rotterdam, of course, is another one. Currently, on the American eastern seaboard, there is no port that can actually accommodate these very gigantic containers. But I'm sure they'll redeem that very soon. There we are. We've got these vessels going through the canal. This is another one here. I'm sorry, again, it's out of focus. And here, of course, is another use for the canal too, which will no doubt continue to happen, as long as it doesn't get blocked. The number of ships transiting, of course, and the Canal Authority hopes that its revenues will increase from the current 5.3 billion to 17.2 billion by 2023. As I said a minute ago, there is some doubt about this. The canal still cannot take the largest generation of crude oil tankers, but also those revenues depend really on the economies of Europe and the Far East, either side of the canal. I think there's also, the economists have actually voiced some concern that actually, or scepticism really, how much the canal revenue is going to revive the Egyptian fortunes with that total decline in tourist revenue. I'm sure some of you have been to Egypt, as Julian and I have last year, and it was brilliant. Everywhere was completely empty. We had Luxor, we had everywhere to ourselves. But this is not much fun for the Egyptians, who've depended enormously, of course, as you know, on tourist revenue, and that has dropped drastically. So I think that's also, there's been a lot of sort of sniping, I think, in a way, but understandably, that in fact the $8 billion that the widening and deepening of the canal has cost could very well have been spent better, I think, on shoring up the Egyptian economy and improving the structure, actually, of the delta, which is disintegrating at the moment. And I think those of you who do know Egypt will know that the structure of the country, the roads, the railways, and so on, are in a dismal state. And I think it's conceivable that the money could have been better spent on the structure of the country rather than on the canal. But on the other hand, it is an astonishing vision, and the idea of those canals, 6 canals going under that canal through to the Asian side, plus the development of a huge industrial zone, which the idea is that it should actually sort of absorb some of the enormous 12.8% unemployment actually, in Egypt, it's a nice visual. It hasn't begun. Some of the tunnels have begun, but it's a long way off, and of course the tunnels will also be significant for the security of the Sinai Peninsula, which, as you know, has had a lot of problems with Islamists attacking the transport in the Sinai Peninsula. So I think there are quite a number of queries about the whole business. I just think it's very imaginative of Sisi to have said, let's go ahead, let's get this done. It's crucially important, not only economically, but also for the image of Egypt, actually, I think. There is just one other problem, actually, which doesn't really affect the economy or anything else, but I thought that de Lesseps would have been intrigued by this, which I don't really need to talk about. You can see yourself what is involved, but the invasion of the Mediterranean by alien species from the Red Sea. And that, I think, is a rather nice note almost to end on. Of course, the Israelis are complaining that it upsets their fishing, but I think it's a rather intriguing aspect of the Suez Canal. So here we are, back to Joseph Conrad. I think a dismal and profitable ditch was absolutely right. He was writing this, actually, when he had passed through the canal several times. This is a quotation from his Outcast of the Islands. But I think it's rather delicious. And I like the idea of that was the sea before the time when the French mind set the Egyptian muscle in motion and produced a dismal but profitable ditch. And I think that is basically what Sisi has been able to do for the time being. Anyway, thank you very much. We'll end there.
Well, Sarah's very kindly said she can manage a quarter of an hour's questions or so. Could I ask a first question? I mean, I think by any standards it is quite an achievement where they've got to. Can you say a bit more about both the capital and the labour? Did they get money from the International Bank and so on?
No, they didn't actually. Sisi forswore any international money. It was all he put up. Only Egyptians could buy bonds for the canal, which they did. There was no international financing, there was no international labour, and there was no forced labour, because originally when de Lesseps built his canal, there was an extremely cruel system of the corvée, which was forced labour from the fields, from the farming communities of Egypt up and down the Nile, who were obliged to dig in the canal in conditions of great hardship, as you can imagine. The labour for this new canal was well paid, and it was all Egyptian, but they did have to bring in foreign dredgers, actually, because I should have put in a picture of the dredgers, because they are enormous, and they did have to turn to the Dutch in particular, and also the Danes for dredging machinery, in order, in fact, to get it done in time. I think the local Egyptian machinery was really not going to get to Sisi's timetable sufficiently quickly. Is it correct that the Chinese have put some money into the new industrial zone?
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, I did. Did have the Chinese put some money into the new industrial zone? I wouldn't be at all surprised. I mean, rather as in fact they financed the expansion of Felixstowe. That would not have happened without Chinese money. And I think it's more than likely that they will have put money into the industrial zone.
Sorry, there's a second question, which is that I've heard from people who've been in the canal that there have been various attacks, and one or two ships have been sunk very recently, I think within the last month or two, and therefore something's going on which hasn't been very well reported, but I don't know the details of it. Do you?
This is the fact that apparently some ships have been sunk in the canal in very, very recent weeks, I think. I hadn't heard about this. But I will certainly check. I think it's very interesting. And, I mean, as you know, the Sinai Peninsula is not a safe area at the moment, which is one very good reason why, in fact, they are building those tunnels in order to facilitate the movement of troops. because they really do need to. There are, I think, 3 main bridges over the canal at the moment, but they are road bridges and not that big either. So I think the tunnels, but they're a long way from being finished. So I must check that one. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you if you thought that this might be seen.
Sorry?
The expansion of the Suez Canal and deepening of the Suez Canal has cost a lot of money. And you said in your brilliant lecture that it could have been spent on the people of Egypt. But do you see this, can this be viewed as being a big political stunt which General Sisi has pulled off to be able to mask the shrinking political freedoms in Egypt and to rally people around a national project, so to speak? And just following up on that lady's question, is the Sinai Peninsula is inhabited with these Islamists who are pretty rapid in attacking ships on the Suez Canal. How safe is that expansion going to be from these Islamists? Noting that insurance policy.
Right. Okay. So there's 2 issues here. Let's do the first one. I think the lady was suggesting that it was a political stunt of Sisi's to distract attention from the, if you like, the economy of the country and the state of the structure. I think, in a way, that is one way of putting it. I don't actually particularly go along with that. I mean, I think it was, if you like, a stunt that the country needed. The widening and deepening of the canal had already begun 4 years before, and Sisi simply took the opportunity to speed it up as much as he could, because the country, apart from anything else, needed, I think, a boost to its morale. I mean, I'm no great admirer of Sisi in other respects, but I do think that he pulled this off with remarkable style, and I congratulate him on it, actually. I do still think that the country really could have done with that $8 billion spent on its structure, but on the whole, I think Egypt perhaps needed a stunt like this. As for the security of the so-called industrial zone, I think that's a long way off being built, despite if there is Chinese money going into it, despite that. And I think it's hard to talk about the security. Obviously, it will include military there. That'll be vital. But how it'll actually work out, I really don't know. And I'm not sure that it's fully worked out by the Egyptians yet, because, again, depends on the flus that comes in, doesn't it?
Sorry, you mentioned $8 billion. What is the actual revenue from the canal every year? Because it's the biggest dollar earner, I understand.
Yeah. Mm.
So, what is it, 2 billion a year?
I have to look at my notes. It's considerably more than that. I think it's currently about 5 billion. But of course that depends considerably on whether shipping, how much shipping is affected by the downturn of economies, both to the east and to the west. And that is the big question mark, actually, over the canal at the moment.
But it could be argued that therefore it's money well spent, because the revenue return is extremely good.
I think, personally, it's money well spent, yes. The Egyptian people put up the money. They could buy, what do you call them? You could buy shares in the hotel, in the canal, and they did it very quickly. It was very well sold. It was very popular. And I think it was viewed, perhaps, by the Egyptians as a rather glamorous project to counter all the gloom and doom of their decline in the tourist industry. Mind you, it's quite interesting that they could afford, because so many Egyptians have suffered hugely from the decline in that tourist industry, as all of you know who've been there recently.
No more questions? Well, we've had a stirring description of what is a romantic as well as a really historic project right from the start. I think there was chapter number 1, which is the digging of the original canal. You brought us up to date with chapter 2. There's undoubtedly going to be a chapter 3, and I think we'll look to our speaker to keep in touch, to come back over the years and keep us up to date. Thank you very much.